Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your patience. I think we got everything squared away now, and we are thrilled to have you join us this morning. But certainly what's happened in our country in the last day or so, I thought it'd be fitting if we started with a moment of silence, thinking about the victims and the families of both our nearby city of Dayton and our friends and loved ones in El Paso. Would you join me in a moment of silence? Thank you. Let us all pray for those in positions of power to have the courage to do what needs to be done to protect children and families in America. We want to welcome Dr. Ramsey and her great team at Mason Tillman. They got in last evening and are thrilled to have them here sharing this important work with us. Obviously, Nana Watson, President of NAACP, Director Demita Brown, Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and everybody here. When I took office almost 4 years ago, I challenged my directors to place a high standard on the role of diversity and inclusion at the City of Columbus, pushing for stronger recruitment strategies and tasking leadership to champion the value of diversity. At the same time, I called for a disparity study for the city. The first one in the city of Columbus since 1993. I was just sharing with Dr. Ramsey, that was the year I graduated from high school. And I ain't no spring chicken, so it's been a while. Because I knew that we had to make real and sustainable policy changes in the future, we needed to look at where we had been in the past. Last month, we received the study. Mason Tillman found that there were disparities for African American businesses, Asian American businesses, and Native American businesses in prime contracts. The study also reported an underutilization of women-owned businesses on contracts over $100,000. The study also showed disparities for African American, Asian American, and women-owned businesses for subcontracts. In addition to the study findings, Mason Tillman also provided recommendations for us in moving forward to level the playing field for all businesses. Today, we're asking for community feedback on the study to incorporate into our plans moving forward. To be clear, our departments have already implemented some of these changes since the end of the data period Mason Tillman reviewed. Earlier this year, we put out a utilization report that shows our successes. In 2017, we saw a 50% increase in city spending with minority and women-owned businesses. In 2018, we saw another 24% increase over 2017. 15.58% of our contracts last year were awarded to minority and female-owned businesses. So starting at 8, going to 12, now to nearly 16% of our spend being with minority spend. Some good progress, but good is not good enough for the people of Columbus. We've had successes as one of the largest employers in the city in recruiting and hiring workers that reflect the diversity of this great city. In fact, the last 2 police and fire classes were the most diverse in the division's history and the highest scoring. So we are excited about some of the progress we're seeing in a great cadet program in the Division of Fire. It's already showing huge gains and results, and a cadet program starting in the Division of Police that are going to serve as pipelines for those divisions for the future. Very proud of the work that Director Brown and our directors are doing and the work that has gotten started. But now we have an analysis of how we can improve from a policy standpoint, and excited about being able to move forward together. We are striving to make Columbus America's opportunity city, but we can't realize that vision until we first become America's equal opportunity city. Thank you all for being here, and I want to introduce another great partner of ours in this work, Please welcome the president of the local NAACP, Ms. Nana Watson.
You know, the NAACP has been engaged and had conversation about the disparity study since 2017. It has been a journey. The report has validated what this community has known. Blacks and women have not received their fair share of the economic pie. Mayor, thank you for your commitment to diversity, particularly as it relates to Black businesses and women-owned businesses. Thank you so very, very much, and I'm going to applaud you for that. Director Brown, thank you for all that you've done and your staff, because you are the driving force behind this disparity study. We are now ready for phase 2. We must be patient because this is a challenge. It did not occur overnight, and it will take time to correct. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Ramsey, the president of Mason Tillman Associates, who has assisted the city of Columbus in collecting this data. I don't know how much data you've collected, but it's a bunch. So welcome.
Good morning, all. And I want to express my appreciation for your decision to spend your morning with us. I recognize those of you who are running a business, you need to be about your business in order to take care of your business. So the fact that you're here today says a great deal about your commitment to this project and your interest and desire to have improved access to the contracting that the City of Columbus does. So by way of introduction, with me this morning is Don O'Bannon, who's our legal advisor and who has helped us through this process and many others over the last 7 years. And so we're very pleased to have his expertise as part of our team. And with that assistance, we've been able to complete 142 studies, and many of them have been in cities comparable to Columbus. We've also been in New York City, which is comparable to nothing, but that's okay also. And we also had the good fortune of having 2 local businesses agree to be part of our team, and you probably are familiar with both Blazing the Way and Supplier Diversity Research. And so that gave us a particularly useful insights into how this city operates and access to those of you who agreed to be interviewed when we did the interviews for the anecdotal portion. But before I talk about what our study findings were or how that study process was undertaken, I'm going to ask Don to tell you how and why this study was performed in the manner in which we conducted it.
All right, class. Welcome to Disparity Study 101. Prior to 1989, the Supreme Court had allowed what was called a rational basis test. And what that meant basically was that as long as the government had a rational basis for using race or gender-conscious measures, it was constitutionally okay. But something dramatic happened. And in 1989, in a decision called Richmond v. Croson, the Supreme Court changed that standard from a rational basis test to a strict scrutiny test. Strict scrutiny was the standard that was used to analyze Jim Crow decisions. So it is the highest standard of review. And the saying in the courts basically was strict in scrutiny, fatal in fact. And what that meant was that it was hard for any program or any governmental conduct that was subject to a strict scrutiny standard to survive Supreme Court review. That's what that meant. But the Supreme Court moved it to strict scrutiny. The federal government for federal contracts adopted strict scrutiny in Adirondack versus Pena, and you see these two decisions. Now, it created a test. And the test basically is that there must be a compelling interest for the governmental entity to use race or gender-conscious measures. And what does that mean? A compelling interest means there must be a statistical finding that there is significant disparity between availability and utilization. That's a tongue tire. Let me try that again. There must be evidence, as the chart shows, of systematic racial discrimination. And that is established by having a strong basis in evidence, which is a significant statistical disparity between availability and utilization. Y'all got me? What that means is, now it is business availability. The court expressly rejected in Richmond. There weren't many contours to this area of the law when this decision came out. But one thing they did make clear, Richmond was a majority-minority city, and they said population cannot be used as a basis for determining this disparity. Population can't be used. What can be used are the available businesses in that community that do the business of that governmental entity. All right? So, compelling interest. Then the other side of that is that the remedy must be narrowly tailored. What does that mean? Narrowly tailored means that only those individuals who have been impacted by the discrimination may be included in the remedy. Now, in Richmond, in part of their program, they had Eskimos, all right? That they were a protected group, Eskimos. And the Supreme Court basically said, look, I don't think there are a whole lot of Eskimos trying to do business with the city of Richmond. Your program is over-inclusive because it includes a group that does not have a history of being impacted by the discrimination of the city. So it can't be overbroad. You have to be impacted by the discrimination. So narrowly tailored. And then the last component, well, there are a couple of more, but the last component for this slide is that the evidence has to be updated periodically. What does that mean? That means that evidence cannot become stale. The practices of the governmental entity 20 years ago do not accurately reflect what the practices are of the government today. So you have to periodically go back, refresh your evidence to determine that what was going on 20 years ago that justified the program still exists today. Everybody cool? Y'all got me? All right, good. What are the objectives? Very simple. The objectives of a disparity study are, one, to determine, is there a statistically significant disparity? Number two, ascertain the practices affecting any documented disparity. I get excited by words. Writing words, the beauty of words excites me. And Sandra Day O'Connor had something when she talked about anecdotal evidence. And all anecdotal evidence is your individual experience, your individual account. Why they can't say your experience versus anecdotal, I can't tell you, but they use the word anecdotal, plain English. But she wrote something that says the anecdotal evidence, those testimonies, those witness statements, brings the statistics to life. They explain why your statistics are where they are. those experiences are a reflection of the interaction of these ethnic and gender communities with the governmental entity. So you are looking at ascertaining from those experiences the practices that are affecting your documented disparity, if you have one. Assess the effectiveness of your race and gender neutral programs. Provide detailed program recommendations, and you have an expert on this team in the sense that we've been all over this country in every major city, and we can bring a lot of good past practices to the forefront because we've seen a lot of different programs and a lot of different iterations of these programs. And then prepare a report with your narrowly tailored remedies. Your goals need to be based on your race and gender disparity studies. There is a case out of the Fourth Circuit in which a study was adopted by the state of North Carolina. The state of North Carolina was challenged. One of the areas that they were challenged was that white women were used in the state DOT program. After the study, the court looked at the statistical evidence. There was no evidence that women had been underutilized or a significant statistical disparity. In fact, the evidence was contrary, that there was overutilization of white female-owned business in DOT contracting for the state of North Carolina. And the court struck down that portion of the revised state program, which included women. Has to be narrowly tailored to those who are victims of the discrimination. I mean, this has some murky parameters, but that's not one of them. It is clear what those requirements are to have a constitutionally sound program that will not be subject to being overturned and will withstand the challenge. So this program, obviously, I'm sure, will not have Eskimos as part of the group, but that is what you're looking at. Your goals have to be limited to the groups with disparities, and then your goals need to be defined by groups' percentage of availability. So if you have 11% of one group, that's your availability in that marketplace. Everyone with me? All right. So you have to have narrowly tailored race and gender remedies. Let me just say one other thing on gender. Gender does not subject to strict scrutiny, subject to a lesser standard called intermediate scrutiny. And I say that we've applied the higher standard of review, and we do that generally for all of our studies. But just for the, as a footnote, I want you to understand that MTA knows that there are different standards of review, constantly reminded people, and that strict scrutiny is only for race, women, intermediate scrutiny, a lesser standard of review, all right? And I think those are my 3 slides, all right? All passing today? Good. Thank you.
All right, so if you're like me and you've got a lot of C's, maybe you got an A this time. It makes you feel good to offset the reality of what you really get when you don't work as hard as you should. So to the statistical findings, we'll start with bringing to your attention the fact that this study covered a specific time period, and it covered effectively all of the city's contracts that were awarded for our 2 for-profit businesses. And so we were looking at the period where the contracts awarded effective January 1 and any contract awarded up to and including December 31st, 2015, and looked at contracts awarded in these 3 industries. So the sources of data that we had available to us varied, excuse me, but the initial part of a disparity study is to collect the prime contracts. And from the prime contracts, we could then determine which of those contracts we wanted to attempt to collect subcontracts. And I use the word attempt to collect because subcontracts in this city, as has been our experience around the country, tend not to be compiled systematically. The minorities and women or small businesses, depending on the program in place, may be collected, but we needed to have all subcontracts, those awarded to people of color, to women, small businesses, and all other businesses. And so there was a collection process that we had to engage in order to reconstruct the subcontracts. And we did a separate analysis, which I'll discuss with you in a moment, of those subcontracts. And then, as Don has indicated, the other side of this equation is the available businesses. And so we had to enumerate businesses that were in the city, in the market area, that were interested, willing, and able to do the city's business. So we looked at the successful businesses, those who bid and received, those who bid and did not receive, as well as we took businesses from the certification lists that are maintained by the state. Federal government has a number of programs that you are no doubt aware of. The Small Business Administration certifies disadvantaged businesses in the hub zone, women, veterans, variety, and all of those that were in our market area were enumerated. We also collected from those of you who are members of advocacy groups and professional and trade groups, your listings as well. Chambers were collected, and we did several business community meetings. All of those sources provided us with businesses that were potentially willing. In the case of the businesses that bid for the city's contracts were obviously willing. The fact that they were able to amass all of the required documents and put the wheelbarrow to deliver it to the city was certainly evidence of their willingness to do city contracts. And so those businesses were presumed to be both willing and able. The other businesses, we had to do the research to ensure that they were willing. There was extensive effort undertaken in this study to ensure that the data that we analyzed was comprehensive. The initial data set was provided to us by the Office of the City Auditor, and that information was then scrubbed. We defined the industries that were represented by each of those contracts, and that information then was re-examined by the city and determined that the classifications by industry and the contracts included were appropriate. There was subsequent discussion with the departments that had concerns that perhaps the data was not complete, and over the course of a number of months, they were able to find some federal contracts that had not been captured in the auditor's system in the manner in which it could have been provided to us. And so when those issues were resolved, we got sign-off by all departments as well and proceeded to prepare the report, which was submitted in draft in July. And you have before you the executive summary that accompanies the final report, which has just recently been submitted to the city. So we are at this juncture where we're in a position then to talk about data, which all parties within the city agree is complete, and that the contracts have been organized and classified by the correct industries and present data that we can now all appreciate is comprehensive and reflect what occurred during this period of 2012 to 2015. So one of the first things that we did once we determined the complete data and grouped our data by industry is to find out where the city's dollars were being spent. And what we determined that 74%, roughly 75% of the dollars was spent within the county. And so for that, given that fact, we concluded that the market area was Franklin County, and the business numbers that I will present to you representing the availability represent businesses within Franklin County. and the roughly 25% of the dollars was spent outside of the county. So, what was the utilization of the city? And what is presented here is a summary of the total contracts awarded and the total dollars that were paid during that time period for those contracts. And so you can see the information as it is reflected, and it'll give you an appreciation of the number of contracts that we had to analyze. We also give you an overview of the businesses, the percent of businesses in the market area by industry, ethnicity, and gender. And so you can see from this order that 19% of the businesses in Franklin County willing and able to do business with the city of Columbus were African Americans, Asian Americans 2.27%, the Hispanics 1.7%, Native Americans 1.4%, and Caucasian females 11%. And then the balance would be non-minority males, represented roughly 63% of the businesses in construction that were willing and able to do the city's contracts. And the same numbers are, in turn reported for professional services, goods, and services. So let's just look for the moment. Was there a question?
The African-American female was put under African-American.
In that particular representation. They will be broken out as we proceed.
Okay.
Yes. And you will note in the final report, they are broken out. Each ethnic group's female and males are broken out. So for construction contracts, the key findings, now this represents all construction contracts. I will in a minute talk about contracts in which we have set parameters to remove the outliers, so we are not talking about the very large contracts. But for purposes of the presentation, what you can see here for all contract dollars, without regard to the number, the size of the contracts, this represents the distribution of the total dollars that were spent by the city. But when you proceed, and then look at dollars over $100,000. This is over $100,000 required to have advertising with its public dissemination of the solicitation. And what we have here is the red represents the dollars that were actually paid to the group, and blue is the dollars expected. Expected dollars are defined by the availability. When you look at the availability and you divide it by the different ethnic groups, gender within those ethnic groups, that constitutes their percentage in the total, represents what is expected to be received. So if you're 10% of the pool of businesses, then according to the court, the expectation is that you will receive 10% of the dollars. And so you can see here the red is the actual dollars, the blue is what was expected. And for most of the groups, it is the case that they received less than expected. And then the lion's share of that difference that they did not receive is reflected in the non-minority males that received more than expected. That's for contracts 100,000 to 1.5 million. And again, we remove the outliers. That's why the upper limit in this presentation is 1.55, because we took out the outliers, the large contracts that limited with limited number of businesses, regardless of ethnicity and gender, could perform the very large contracts. That's the domain of a very exclusive number of contractors, some of whom work all over the country and gobble up these big contracts. But if you take this level, you can see what it is. Now, what is also quite notable is that when you look at the informal contracts where advertising is not required, and you're talking about 100,000 and under, you still have the same distribution. A few more dollars to a few more minorities or women, but effectively the overriding share of those dollars that were under 100,000 informal contracts, solicitation not required, that those dollars still went to non-minority males. and we move into professional services, you're going to see a similar pattern. Again, you have the key findings as to where the dollars were spent. But when we look at those and we divide those to, again, in professional services, under 50,000, over 50,000, it's required to advertise. So here we set the upper limit at 420,000 because when we remove the outliers, 75% of the contracts were under $420,000. And therefore, that defined that group for purposes of analysis. And so that takes and addresses the concern that we have seen in some of the cases. And although in your class of your Law 101, the professor didn't make reference to this fact, but there have been a number of challenges which have said that the minority population had a disparity because they lacked the capacity to perform the contracts. And so to address that, anticipate that criticism, we have limited the size of contracts subject to analysis to a level that removes the outliers, those very big contracts. And so again, you can see what the actual spend is versus what was expected based on the percentage of the group. And this is for contracts over 50,000 where there was advertising. When you go to under 50,000, no advertising required. You see a pattern which is comparable to those where there is an advertising. So here, these are contracts, 50,000 and under, and once again, minorities and women, for the most part, are not receiving the expected level of contracted. This pattern is present again when you look at goods and services. And these are goods and non-professional services, so it would be computer maintenance, landscaping, a variety of services, installation of various and sundry items, and the goods, materials, and supplies that the city purchased. And here reflected the key findings, the percent of the dollars that were awarded to each group. And then again, when we break this out, here, informal, under 20,000, there is no requirement. So when we look at 20,000 to 180, again, removing the outliers, you see the pattern again is reflected in these numbers. And when we go to the under 20,000, 19,999, you still have the same pattern. So we also looked at subcontracts, as I mentioned, and that process was very extensive reconstruction in an effort to try to identify all of the construction subcontracts awarded on the contracts. And the contracts that we attempted to reconstruct were contracts over 200,000. We needed a sizable enough pool to try to reconstruct the subcontracts. So the key findings in the subcontracts reflected in this particular presentation, you can see that, again, the non-minority males received almost 90% of the subcontracts that were awarded. And again, actual dollars versus expected dollars, so that you have the presentation with one exception, that the actual dollars are actually lower than the expected dollars. And that's on subcontracts in construction. And again, we used all the prime contracts in an effort to try to find the subcontractors for those contracts. So on professional services, subcontracts, and we looked at subcontracting in construction and professional services. We do not look at it in goods and services because doesn't lend itself to subcontracting, and certainly not to identifying who manufactured the box that Dell put its computer in. It just doesn't lend itself to that. So this study looked at subcontracting, both construction and professional services, not in goods and services. So again, if you look at the awards in the subcontracts, and we look at total dollars awarded to professional service subcontracts, again, we have actual dollars versus expected dollars in this presentation. So where does that leave us? We are to examine, as Don has indicated, whether there is a underutilization of the contractors that represent women and people of color. And if that underutilization is statistically, if there is underutilization, and if it is statistically significant, it qualifies as a disparity and subject to a remedy. And so this gives you your prime contract disparity results for construction contracts. And you can see that we have done a analysis by gender in this presentation in order to appreciate the fact that women are subject to a lesser standard, and thus women only need to be underutilized. And while we examined Caucasian women as a group, we also did ethnic women as a group. And so in some instances, the ethnic males, the females are underutilized, although they do not have a disparity. So where they are underutilized, they too are subject to the remedy, because the court in Croson applied strict scrutiny only to MBEs, because that was the nature of the program that the city of Richmond was operating. It was an MBE program, not an MWBE program. Yes, ma'am.
Can you help me with the definition between disparity and underutilized?
Overutilized.
Oh, no, it's like there's disparity and then there's underutilized.
Yeah, the underutilized females didn't have a disparity, but they were underutilized. So their use was lower than their availability, which was lower than their availability, and thus they are subject to a program. They did not, taken separately, they didn't have a statistically significant disparity, but they were underutilized, and that's the standard that has to be met for women. And so we distinguish that in the case of women, where, and that's pertinent, where the male group didn't have a disparity, but the women were underutilized. And so that's what that is attempt to show. And then in the case of Hispanic males, they did not have a disparity, but in, on the contracts, the smaller contracts, they were actually overutilized. So they could not have a presence in the absence of a disparity, they could not have a remedy, but where they're overutilized, there's nothing that you can do for that group. Because the court is very clear, you cannot, if you exceed, you cannot be subject to a program. And keep in mind too, that this analysis or the court standard is applying a remedy only to women and to people of color. It did not apply it to non-minority males, and it didn't consider women. So when you look at professional services, you have some similar results. You have, in the case of professional services, you have Asian American males who are actually overutilized. Not only do they not have a disparity, but they are overutilized. And then you have Hispanic females who are underutilized. And Native Americans, there were just simply too few contracts in the professional service side to even examine it. And then Native American females were, on the smaller contracts, there was no disparity, and they were overutilized. So goods and services, also looking at the prime findings, you can see here a pattern where some groups have no disparity and some do have disparity depending on the dollar threshold. And again, a disparity is important and necessary for males. For women, it can be underutilized without a disparity, and it would still make them eligible for a remedy. Subcontracting in construction, you can see again that you have one group is overutilized, Hispanic American males, and subcontracting are overutilized, and therefore not subject to a remedy. Professional services, you have African American males had no disparity, And Asian American males also had no disparity, but they were overutilized. And you can be underutilized, but statistically it's not low enough for there to be detected a disparity. And that would give you, they wouldn't be overutilized, but they are not, the difference between use and availability was not sufficient for a disparity to be discerned. As Don has indicated, the court has given us the authority to look at the perceptions of business owners and to take it into consideration. However, they're very clear that you cannot use the anecdotal evidence in lieu of a statistical finding. You can use it to explain the statistics, and you can also use anecdotal to help in defining and detailing the nature of your remedies, because there are remedies that are both race-specific and race-neutral. And the anecdotal evidence in giving meaning to the numbers is very helpful in formulating policy that can correct some of the underutilization. It has proven not to be a solution to eradicating underutilization, but it certainly can facilitate the correction. Race-specific remedies have yet to be found to be otherwise, other than using race-specific remedies, it has not been found that you can effectively eliminate disparity, but you can certainly eliminate some of the barriers that create disparity by looking at the anecdotal and taking into consideration what has been experienced by businesses and what are some of the solutions that can be implemented to address that. And so clearly, in terms of the anecdotal, and some of these findings are consistent with what has been perceived by businesses around the country in our experience, when those entities have disparity, there are often some very similar patterns of procedures that are in place. And one is this issue of bid information. How difficult is it to get information? And it's not just a public release on the formal side, but the timing of that release. Do you get inside information when a project is upcoming so that you can plan, so you can identify your team, you can get your suppliers lined up? You have that side of the issue. And then on the informal contracts where advertising is not required, do you hear about those opportunities before an award is made? And so that is a consideration, and it's one that can make a significant difference. If you don't know about a contract, you certainly cannot submit a bid when it's not publicly advertised. Also, prime contracts bundled is a matter that is very much in vogue around the country, although many of our clients and those who have done, other entities that have done disparity studies and made the mistake of hiring a different consultant, they still have begun to move toward reassessing the size of the contracts and the packaging of those contracts into multi-year contracts. Contracts where one vendor, it receives an award and departments across the city can use that contract and it lasts for several years. That's a practice that has taken hold and is beginning to wane in its use, because agencies see that established relationships, even at the term of a 3-year contract where you have serviced all departments in a city. It's very difficult for a new vendor to come in and compete because of the relationships that you've created in having had that opportunity so long and having serviced so many departments. So that's something that certainly is not race-specific, but from our anecdotal, businesses felt that really needed to be reconsidered. And then the pre-qualification requirement, which the City of Columbus has, that requires the bidder for a construction contract to be pre-qualified. It's an extensive process, roughly 35 pages in that program that you have to adhere to, but it also requires a subcontractor to be pre-qualified for a prime to use the subcontractor. And clearly, subcontractors are the last to know about an opportunity, so to poise themselves and be ready for that. So that's something that needs to be considered, and businesses felt that that had a significant impact on their ability to do work. And then a lead time to submit a bid. If you get advance notice, you can then have a public solicitation that has a short term and you can be responsive. But if you don't have advance notice, then a solicitation that has a short term time between advertisement and submission of bids or proposals does make a difference. Vendors also talked about excessive monitoring that they thought was disparate in its treatment. They felt that as a person of color or female, they were monitored more heavily, and that monitoring didn't provide the support. There would be an observation that your line was off and you were dug a trench in the wrong place, but you wouldn't be told by the inspector that the trench was offline until you had covered the trench up and placed the pipe in it. But that seems to be, well, it doesn't matter, but it does if you're not doing that consistently across the line, across all businesses. And so those are issues, and payment is probably a national problem, and some governments now have moved to actually put in place prompt payment provisions and hold their managers to that. The notion that the invoice arrives and it sits on the desk of the manager until the time that it's due to be paid, and then the manager notices you that there's a problem with the invoice. Well, that problem in a prompt payment provision would be noticed to you within the first 5 days of receipt of the invoice, so it affords you an opportunity to remedy those discrepancies and have timely payments. So that's an issue. It's not unique here, but it certainly is an issue that can paralyze a business that has substantial payroll associated with their invoice. So those things came forward from the comments of the businesses, and also a request for a standard procurement process, a formal written set of procedures that as a business person you will know what to expect from a department, what to expect in terms of timing of solicitation, how the notices are given if you're successful, whether there's a debriefing. There are many provisions that reflect themselves in a procurement manual, and so there was a request to have that also part of the change that the city goes about as it looks forward to its new era. There were also barriers identified by businesses that they felt were attributed to the prime contractors for whom they worked. And here, businesses talked about bids being shopped after the prime received its award, that there would be a call that says, you know what, I've got good news for you. Our team has just been awarded the contract, but I just need you to see if you can give me a better price. And so here you have right looming in front of you the opportunity to be successful, but yet you're being asked to lower the price that you thought was the lowest that you could prepare at the time. So that's a practice that businesses have experienced, and asking that those provisions be put in place that would preclude that from happening. And then you get the contract, and you think you're going to do so much work, and you discover that the scope of your work gets reduced, even though you're under contract. Or the other phenomena that businesses talked about, you just get substituted out. You're to do the paving along Main Street, and you come one day and see your prime contractor's trucks, and somebody else is doing the paving on Main Street. You actually got removed from the contract without your even knowing it, without a formal process being carried out. So those things have come out in this anecdotal evidence that we collected from those of you who were kind enough to share with us your experiences. And there were some detailed descriptions of disparate treatment. If you have the time to read the tome that we submitted, you will find, I think, it quite illuminating the kinds of experiences that businesses have described in their efforts to perform their work, to perform it successfully, to get change orders approved and paid in a timely fashion, because that too is very costly. You choose not to resist doing the changed work because you don't want to alienate your client, the prime contractor, nor do you want to leave a bad situation for the city, but you have an expectation the additional work that you perform will be paid for. And so what we found is that some of the contractors said they would do the extra work, but they would not be paid for the extra work, or they wouldn't be paid for what they had priced it to be and what the city had paid the prime to do. And then the businesses that are part of a team, both construction and professional services, not given sufficient time to mobilize their workforce so they are timely in the delivery of their service or their product. And those things sometimes are viewed to be so what, but in fact it is a very significant issue if you are trying to manage an efficient shop and you know there's a job, you want to know when will you start, and you get insufficient notice so that you're not really prepared to start and perform. And it affords too often the prime contractor an opportunity to say to the city, if it so chooses, that the company couldn't perform and therefore we're doing the work, self-performing that work, or they simply do it and indicate to you that it had to be done, and therefore they have proceeded to carry out the work with their own forces. All of those practices that have been described in the report are practices that can be addressed with procedures and standards established by the City of Columbus. And so there is a great opportunity to modify practices and bring them in line with best management practices. So we have made certain recommendations that we think can address the findings that were made in our study. And because we have race and gender specific findings, both of disparity and of underutilization, that you can apply bid discounts on construction and goods and services contracts. And I might note that the concept of bid discount is an effort on a prime contract to offset the disadvantage, the disparate treatment that is evident in the study. And so in the case of a contract that's advertised as a low bid contract, that contract, the two respondents might be a Caucasian male and a Asian female, and the way the bid discount would work, that if they both bid $100,000 for that contract, then the female would get the discount, and that discount would lower her bid, and she would then become the #1 ranked firm. And the city will have to decide what level of bid discount will be applied, but there should be a consideration given to a bid discount. The court has said it's appropriate to find a way to offset the disadvantage, the disparity that is documented in the study. And the same principle would apply if it were a bid for goods or services. So that's one provision that you can have to be put in place that will address the disparity at the prime level. The other one that can be done is at the, for professional services contracts, or contracts where evaluations are the basis of the decision as opposed to dollars. You can in turn have evaluation points. So of the 100 points that are given, some points are given for the experience of the firm, some for the team, some for prior projects, some for the organization of your proposal. You can also have within that 100 points for the ethnicity or gender of the business that fits the eligible class of business that have been found to have a disparity. So that's another way of offsetting that. Also, you can set goals on subcontracts. So the prime contract, when it is advertised, the solicitation will state that there is a goal. And as Don has indicated, that goal cannot exceed the availability of the groups that have a disparity, but you can establish a goal that gets advertised in the bids, the solicitation for proposals or for bids. And the prime will be a responsive prime if they meet the goal or if they submit a good faith effort, which would be a quantitative process that the city would review a document that is set forth and described in the report that would be used to determine if a good faith effort had been made to meet the goal. And if a good faith effort had been made, then in the absence of meeting the goal, that company would be found to be responsive. So those are some of the strategies that we have offered. We also think that there are some race and gender neutral strategies that can be employed that will be beneficial to all businesses, regardless to race or gender, that there are some practices that we think are good, just basic best BMPs, as they would say, best management practices that should be taken into consideration in a procurement program. And starting with a, yes, ma'am.
Are all of these slides included in the larger disparity study, or can we get a copy of these?
You can get a copy of the slides, and I'm sure Mrs. Brown will place it on her webpage before the end of this day. Okay, and the report, I think, is already published, isn't it? Yes. I understand 350 pages is a bit daunting, isn't it? But you have to do that sometimes. So on the race and gender neutral, we think are just good best management practices for government, and they're practices that can be beneficial for all businesses, small businesses, large businesses, businesses owned by people of color, women, Caucasian males, non-minority male organizations. They can all benefit from some good practices. And so one is having a formal procurement policy, which is in writing, which is available on the city's webpage that you can turn to understand how business is done and what is expected of the managers that are handling the procurement within the city and within the respective departments. You also, we think you can implement vendor registration and certification as a one-step process. Minimize paper, make things more efficient, make it more accessible to the business community. And there's also an owner control insurance program, OSEP as it is often referred to. It's used by a number of agencies that intends to bring the insurance requirements and the cost of surety bonds and professional liability insurance within the reach of all businesses, and it unifies the pricing for that because the city will manage that, and they will make it available at the same price to all vendors who are doing city jobs for insurance to cover a city job. And also, we think that a policy of unbundling contracts is important. The notion that you have large contracts that are multi-year really does lock out businesses, and it locks out any business that's not one of those successful vendors. So it is beneficial to all businesses regardless to ethnicity and gender. And then on smaller contracts, many agencies now have eliminated bonding as a requirement on its informal contracts. They feel that getting more contracts within the reach of smaller vendors builds capacity within a community, and a company that can do a number of contracts under 50,000, under 100,000, without having the requirements of a bond will be able to bid larger contracts, bring more competition to the process, and it becomes ultimately good for government and good for reducing the cost of doing business. So that range of size of contract that would be advertised without bonds would be something, if considered, would have to be developed in the policy, but it's worth thinking about and considering bringing those contracts more in line with the capacity. And then dispute resolution, we feel, is absolutely essential, because only those companies that have good relationships can manage those disputes without it costing them in their reputation. And all businesses should have an opportunity to have their issues heard in an environment that is non-hostile and is supportive of them, because things do happen. It's not unusual. There's nothing specific about race or gender that will result in a dispute. You can have misunderstandings for various reasons. But if there's a formal process for handling that, we think it can be much more effective and have less adverse impact on businesses. And then a program is only as good as it is monitored and it is tracked, and it should be reported. The public should, in fact, know how business is being done. And because this study developed its analysis on a ethnic and gender-specific basis, we think reporting should be by ethnic and gender as well. And so there should be regular reporting, and it should reflect the dollars that are being spent with each of the ethnic groups and with women and women of ethnic women as well as Caucasian women. We think that that is warranted in order to know that you are moving toward correcting the disparities that were noted in the study. So we also think that the pre-qualification requirements should be reevaluated. You have a unique set of standards in this city where you have to be pre-qualified to be both a prime and a sub. I know of no other city that requires subcontractors to be pre-qualified. And so you want to really ensure that those are not practices, or in this case, a standard policy that is precluding businesses from doing business with the city, because if so, it does reduce competition and cost the city more to not have the benefit of good and wholesome competition. So we think also that the supplier diversity program needs certain enhancements, because it's going to be fundamental to a successful delivery of service and to a correction to some of the disparities that were identified. And so there need to be formal policies and procedures established, and also to standardize the operation of that policy, because the diversity and inclusion is never successful when it resides in one place. Diversity and inclusion has to be the principle in which a city operates it. It needs to be standard across all actions that are taken in the performance of contracting, not just awarding the contract, executing the contract, and implementing the contract. These principles of equity and inclusion should be broad-based and fundamental, and therefore there needs to be a wholesale commitment to the operating procedures of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And business technical assistance is important. Most governments are doing it, and certainly once a disparity study is done and there is clear evidence of statistical underutilization of any group, then the government is moving toward bringing greater quality to the assistance that is provided. And some of it is as basic as, how do you do business with the entity? What are the hidden rules, the unspoken rules of how you do business? And then the other issue of, how can the city and its partners collaborate to enhance and develop more skill and technical capacity within its business community. And we are in a paperless age now. Technology is indeed the governing almost most, if not all, of the things that we do. And there is technology that can be shared and become part of your operation because it resides with the city and its partners. And so we just think that business technical assistance needs to be reassessed and incorporated as a part of how things are done in the city. And then the enhancement to the certification and vendor registration process, we think, is a necessary change. And clearly, the enforcement of compliance standards. Companies, where there are goals set on a contract, there needs to be compliance at the time that that bid is determined to be responsive, because you cannot put the milk back in once the bottle is empty. So you really have to monitor and manage at the front end, and you can also verify through the life of a project, and at the end confirm the compliance, full compliance with the program. Joint ventures are a technique that is broadly being used now with both majority firms and minority firms and females, and with minority firms and female firms partnering up to enhance their ability to compete. Those are good techniques and techniques to be considered. There is also an advisory council that we think really needs to be given the authority to participate as partners in monitoring the activities of this program that we anticipate you will have approved as an ordinance and will have policies and procedures. But it is good to have business partners working with a diversity and inclusion program to ensure that they are able to bring to the city those experiences that otherwise would be blind to the city by virtue of their not being in the trenches working on a day-to-day basis with businesses. And so that partnership is really core and needs to be given the authority that is warranted in order that they can effectively bring a meaningful participation to the process, both of formulating the program and monitoring and overseeing its implementation over time. And we all know that without adequate staff who are properly trained and who are properly paid, it's very difficult to run any organization in a meaningful and effective way. And so we hope that the city will move forward to adequately staff the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and allow that organization to hire personnel that bring the skills necessary to do work in this particular time in history where technology is essential and where good formal training and skills are also necessary. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Brown, who will talk to you about post-disparity study next steps. And I want to thank you for the opportunity. And as soon as Ms. Brown finishes, we can open it up to questions, if you will. Thank you. Thank you.
So we've covered a lot today with respect to the recommendations that have come out of the disparity study. I just want to highlight a few of them just to give you some framework for our next steps in terms of moving forward. We will immediately begin to work with Mason Tillman to begin to draft the ordinances necessary to implement a strong program. Those program elements will include subcontracting goals, as has been recommended, as well as other remedies that will impact those groups that have been found to have a disparity. Additionally, we will formalize a program that will also go to council for approval. With respect to the staffing, and I'm going to move off of this just a bit, with respect to the staffing, we have already begun restaffing the office. We will continue to do so with the mindset that we need key individuals in key places with particular skill sets in order to move this work forward, which includes, obviously, these new program elements. Simultaneously, as we begin to look at the program, we will also be working across the city and with our departments to formalize our procurement procedures, those things that lack clarity and standardization in our current processes. We'll be working with them to begin to do those things as well. We'll also be training our staff, both the Office of Diversity and Inclusion as well as other staff around the city who have procurement responsibilities around these new program elements. And we will also, throughout this process, ensure that we will engage stakeholders all along the way. It is very important for us to ensure that as we move forward and implement these recommendations and other things that we think will be appropriate in addressing the disparity, that we do so with the mindset of those that are most impacted. And so we will be reaching out to each of you, both here in this room and as well as our businesses across the city, and our prime contractors as well, to become stakeholders in this process, to really understand and hear from you what it is that you would want to see happen as a result of the disparity study and the recommendations that are being put forth, and learn how we can partner together to move this forward. So with respect to time frame, we're estimating that we will begin this work obviously immediately and have it completed over the next 6 to 9 months. One of the first key milestones for us will be ordinances going before council. Our goal is before the end of the year to deal with some of the subcontracting goals as well as some of the program elements that we look to put into place. With respect to the stakeholder engagement, there will be a number of opportunities to engage, not only from formalized meetings such as this, but we will also have survey instruments that will be available online. We will have a business advisory group out of our Office of Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Council to help frame this work moving forward. And we will certainly provide the opportunity for you to remain in touch with us as well. So a lot of work to take place over the next several months. Again, with the mindset that we want to hear from you, we want to partner with all individuals, all businesses across the city in order to do this work, and we want to make it meaningful and have an impact for you and your bottom line as you're moving your businesses forward. With that, I'll close it out. Here are a number of our partners that we've already engaged. We'd love to add you to the list. So please feel free to reach out to us, to connect with us at the end of this meeting, and make sure that we become engaged together in moving this work forward. With that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Ramsey to take any questions, and I will also be available. So with that. Thank you.
Okay. Now, if you don't mind, there was a lady that had a question that I...
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Ramsey. In doing disparity studies, as you have said, around the country, have you seen where cities or states have implemented your recommendations? And can you talk a little bit about the success of those programs and maybe the uptick in or the lessening of disparity in those areas, as well as do those changes, do you see them coming more with buy-in at the administration level or at the project owner level?
I think that the more successful programs are programs that start with legislative approval, and a legislative approval of a program that's fairly detailed, and that in fact goes into an ordinance or policy depending on, or statute. The state of New York, for example, where we did their study, they have just approved a change in a new statute, and I think it's about 50 pages. They're called 15A, but it is the legislators have attempted to define in fair detail all of the components of that program, from what the certification should include, to when you advertise, to how you train, how departments set goals. So you can have a fairly extensive ordinance or statute, as in the case of New York, or it can be a bit more general and leave it to the policies and procedures manual and the small business manual. But what the practice has been over the last 5+ years, it's much more consistent response to the study findings and more systematic movement toward actually changing the way contracting is done. I think there's more openness to inclusion, and I think a greater appreciation for the fact that you have to allow most of your businesses, at least those that are willing, to feed at the public trough, and that it should not be the exclusive domain of a few. I think there is a greater tendency now toward that. Thank you.
Hi. May you explain the difference between the no disparity and then no disparity and overutilization? What's that trigger that causes a firm or a utilization to be overutilization?
Yeah. Overutilization means that you have received more dollars than expected. And in the case of a minority or a woman that would be subject to the benefits of a remedy, they would not be included in the remedy if you are overutilized. You can have no disparity without having parity. So parity is when your use and your availability are equal. But you can have it, your use can be lower than your availability, but it's not low enough to be statistically significant. And the court has defined that basically that underuse in that instance would be due to chance, not to discrimination. So it has to be a much more significant underutilization to be disparity.
I have two questions. My first question is, you've given the percentages of the businesses in the market area. Does your complete 300-page document give us the number of businesses?
No, we do not report out numbers, just percentages.
So can you tell us, did you look at 5,000 businesses, 500, or what was your population pool?
I can't tell you offhand. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
As they would say, I'm not scripted with that figure, but it's a known figure, but I don't know what it is.
And my next question is, under recommendations, you provide very specific percentages for goals under subcontractors in Table 10 and Table 11, but you don't provide that same information for prime contracts, and I'm just curious why.
Yeah, prime contracts, because of the nature of the process, to have a goal, and as it's defined both in the law and as we've defined it in the study, is to say to a prime contractor that there's a % of your contract that you have to award to either a woman or a minority or to both. So that's what a goal allows you to do. In the prime contracts, you don't have a process that would allow you to say that 10% of all prime contracts must go to a certain group. That, in the parlance of the court, is called a set-aside. You cannot set aside for either race or gender. So that's why there are no goals. But what you can do is on each solicitation, you can have provisions to try to offset that disadvantage, and those provisions would be a discount or it would be evaluation points. Yes, please come to the mic.
But to that end, I actually just responded to a set aside for a project. Is there any way that we can look at increasing for projects that are not quite the $1.5 million and over, but ones that are lesser, let's say about a $200,000? Is there a way to look at more set-asides or increased number of set-asides for lower projects to maybe bridge the gap in the disparity?
Well, one of the things you can do is that you can have a small business rotation program that would not be race-specific, because once you introduce race and you have a set-aside, you have contracts that are limited competition, that's called a set-aside, and that's unacceptable. But you can definitely do small business rotation, so you can establish a size of contracts and have small businesses certified as small, and the competition would be limited to those businesses. Because clearly there's a pattern in the data that shows that those contractors who are getting larger, most of the contracts are getting them at all sizes. They gobble up the little ones and the big ones. So yes, that is an option to do a rotation or a small business set aside, but again, it would not be race or gender specific.
Okay, and I'm not sure, I did come in late, and I do apologize for that. Is there going to be another disparity study follow-up, let's say in the successive years of the next 5 years, after we do the implementation, so that we can see how effective the recommendations are as well?
So the question was whether or not there would be an update to the disparity study after we've implemented to see how we're achieving parity. Is that correct? That was your question?
Or just another study in the next successive, let's say, 5 years, because we know that administration's changed from 2012 to 2015. So we know both administration and personnel has changed, and to see how that's changing as we go through that process.
Right. So as Mr. O'Bannon shared earlier, we are required to update the study periodically. So we've not established a time frame as of yet as to when that would occur. But it is safe to say that we will implement another study at some point to evaluate our success moving forward.
You had just mentioned that in some cases, to avoid set aside by gender or race, there are certain goals that could not be set. But you also mentioned that you could, in your contracts, you could have provisions. Are there any states or municipalities that have model provisions that you've been aware of in their solicitations, or who are just, good people to benchmark off of, like New York? You had mentioned New York. And is there any source of looking at model provisions or benchmarks?
Yeah, City of St. Louis has been quite aggressive in its program and progressive in its program. I think that they become a model that you could look at. And some of the utility districts also have created model programs. The Metropolitan Sewer District of St. Louis is one. The Louisville Sewer District is another that has done some fairly progressive things. West Palm Beach, I'm sorry, not West Palm Beach, but Palm Beach County in Florida has been doing some progressive program initiatives. So yes, there are, and I can share with Mrs. Brown those programs that I think are useful. And as she puts together her advisor committee, that's another place to look at entities that are trying to do things that are sort of out of the box, best management practices to bring about more inclusion within the contracting world.
Thank you for your presentation this morning, and to Sister Brown and to you. You mentioned 6 to 9 months to put this in place. Will you be leaving Columbus with some legislation that we could put in place immediately, because the election coming up in this November? And I want to see if they're serious about implementing the program and not just talk. So I need some legislative power to help push the legislation through with the new people that's coming on the council. And I can do that now while they're running, and not after they get there and tell me a lie.
Yeah, let Ms. Brown speak to that. But as I say, when we finish these studies, it's now in the hands of the business community to achieve the objectives that the law will allow and that you would prefer, but Ms. Brown will speak to the specifics of how that process will work.
So this is a bit delicate, but I will say that we are moving very quickly to begin to implement those things that we think we are able to implement fairly quickly. One of those first tasks would be looking at the recommendation around subcontracting goals and putting the framework in place in order to accomplish that. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, we do intend to craft a new program and go before council before the end of the year with that legislation that provides the level of accountability that's needed in order to make the program successful. So while I can't commit to a before-election timeframe, just understand that both the mayor as well as city council certainly understand the nature of this work. We want to be very diligent about how we go about moving forward, but we are very sensitive to the needs to address the disparities that we see.
And to the question that was asked before, progressive approaches to this program, I might note that this is for us a unique experience to be under contract to help formulate the program ordinance and assist in program development at the time of completing the study. So that is an indication, I think, of the city's commitment to actually put an ordinance before its council and to put a program in place before its managers. Yes, sir, you're all on.
I'm frustrated, as you well know, and you well know. My name is Al Washington. I've worked on 15A in New York with the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, and I've done this kind of thing before. And I've attempted to work with the city of Columbus. boy, I'm messing up your name, Mary. But when Steve Francis first came to the city as the diversity and inclusion manager, I reached out to him to say there are some things we need to do. I got very frustrated when the RFP came out that you guys want. The bid was due October 28th, 2016. Then, on December 12th, 45 days later, we changed the code. It's Title 32 right now. Makes no mention of goals for employment. He can talk to the language of 4926, which is pretty much a lot of the guidance we're going to get nationally. We do goal setting based on quote unquote available, ready, and willing. But we're silent on, in my judgment, on two key words in 4926. But for. They make reference when you sit and talk about goal setting. We not only need to be talking about just what's here, but for the effect of past discrimination, certain things aren't here. That language in 4926 permits that. There are so many things that are wrong. City, Columbus, you need to look at some stuff you're doing. Dr. King here and I sat through meetings 2 years ago, and we started to talk about unions. How many minority union contractors are there in this town? Fewer than 5. Yet the city imposes a union requirement. But for the effects of their past discrimination, we've become virtual co-conspirators with the racists. Yeah, and yes, I'll say it again because you said you're taping it. We have become virtual co-conspirators. Of the 17 trades that are signatory to agreements with the city, only 5 are reaching their goals. Over 12, pardon me, I'm saying it wrong. 12 are reaching less than 30% of their minority goals. We ain't union contractors, and we damn near can't get any unions. Yet the city imposes a union requirement. Let's look at some stuff that's for real.
So tell us your recommendation, because your insights are quite vast and deep. So do you give us a couple of recommendations?
Not right now. I'm more than willing. I'll share with you the menu that I had developed for a meeting that I had proposed with Steve Francis years ago.
Okay.
None of those things have been done.
Okay, so that would be good if you could give that to us. I think that would work. And you have highlighted in your comments some of the positions done. I don't know if you want to speak to the but-for or...
The regulation that he's speaking to is 49 CFR Part 26. Used to be, and also I think there's a Part 23. One has to do with airports, and the other is disadvantaged business enterprises. And they do provide a standard for the nation, frankly, of many best practices. And that statute obviously applies, because it is a federal statute, to federally assisted projects, not necessarily locally or state-funded projects. So there are some limitations with that. But at least as a benchmark standard, it does provide some good guidance on everything from evaluating good faith to calculation of goals. And the but-for test is one that is included in the regulations. And again, I would caution anyone who takes a look at this to understand the nuances, because you can't paint in this area with a very broad brush. So I would simply exercise some care. But those are excellent comments.
Thank you very much.
Not that you need my opinion.
Anyone else have a recommendation or a comment or a question before we close our session?
I think this study is great. I hope that you proceed through with it. I will do a follow-up with Ms. Brown. I feel that some of the points that you have put out, subcontracting with professional, because I have a professional service, but the larger companies have been getting the real estate deals that the City of Columbus has, especially the libraries, etc. I feel that I don't have 6 months to 9 months to wait for a study to be in place, because property is being sold every day. I have clients that called me and asked me to try and find commercial buildings, etc., for them, where they're larger companies such as Ohio State University has gotten the library that just closed on Long Street with the new library being built. So who do I follow up with to try to see where these avenues are that can take place?
Thank you for your question. So I would direct you to our Department of Development. I think that's a first good step, to sit down with them to understand what's happening, how you become engaged, and how we can connect you better. I would start there. I would also highlight, and I hadn't done this earlier, some of the work that the Department of Development has done around our small business ecosystem. That work has looked at the ecosystem around small businesses in our city and in Central Ohio broadly, around the needs and what's occurring, and how we as a city can play a part in that. And so as we begin to move forward, both from a disparity study standpoint and to your question about real estate, all of those things, all of those questions are coming to the forefront. And with that work combined with the work of the disparity study, I am very optimistic that we'll begin to move forward in very positive ways. So if we can connect afterwards, I'll make sure we make those connections for you.
That question also made me reflect on the fact that the city of Cincinnati has done some very progressive programs. And so as you think about or ask about this whole notion of what are some models of best management practices, you should look online at the city of Cincinnati's program. Is there another question? And I know that as you sit, you lose the opportunity to complete another invoice or make a call to get collections for a long outstanding invoice. But I don't want us to close without benefiting from any other comments or suggestions or recommendations as the city goes forward with this program. Please feel free to come.
Sorry, my name is Tamara Lindsay, and I'm the CEO of and owner of Luna Energy Partners. We're a holistic energy efficiency company, not only from energy efficiency in the traditional sense, but innovation and even financing and generation. But like I was saying, the city of Pittsburgh is a model we can truly look at if we want to implement change. As I said, I opened up an office there, and we have done very well in the city of Pittsburgh because they do practice what they preach. They do believe in minority contracting, women-owned contracting, because they understand that bridging that gap is not only going to benefit us as business owners, but it's also going to benefit them from an economic standpoint as well.
I would employ you to look at the section in the report that describes the highly used contractors, so you can see how concentrated the contract awards are with a limited number of businesses. And I believe the objective that you want to strive for is to broaden that base and to have more of the vendors who are doing some business to get more significant business. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for coming today, and we delivered to you this report, and it's now in the hands of the community and the city to move forward to make this city a more diverse city in its award of contracts, use of those vendors, and the redistribution of the dollars. And so thank you very much for the opportunity to work with you, and thanks for coming out. And have a good and profitable afternoon.